I hope everyone would enjoy this afternoon session. I'm sure you will do, because this is such a great session. And I'm very honored to chair it. And although we really need to be tight in our timing, I really wish to congratulate the organizers, because this is such a great conference. And I'm very honored to chair this session, which is filled with distinguished speakers. So Dublin, in the expectations of many, and perhaps in the expectations of everyone, the reform of the common asylum system was to be very much a reform of the Dublin regulation, or of the Dublin criteria at least, or the Dublin hierarchy, or at least, at the very least, of their implementation, in the name of a solidarity which is felt as extremely weak, or indeed completely lacking. And a system which, under Article 80 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, should be based on solidarity, but yet it is very much short of solidarity, needed a change. So this session is very much devoted to understand whether a change has been accomplished, or at least proposed at this stage, whether this change is satisfactory, whether we can be happy with the proposal, whether this proposal had a good chance to work at least. So this is all about my introduction, because I really, really don't want to leave to. I really want to leave time and all the room they need to our speakers, and so I'm very glad to leave the floor to Daniel Tim, I need to recall you that you have like 12 minutes. Thank you.
Thanks indeed, and welcome to everyone. Let me also start by expressing my gratitude for the invitation and the organization of the workshop. I participated yesterday afternoon as a fellow and was impressed both by the quality of the interventions and the debate. I have been asked to address a sensible topic, which is often ignored in academic circles, even though it is highly relevant for the policy debate, so-called secondary movements. My comments will be based on a blog post which has been published a few days ago in a special collection of the EU immigration and asylum law blog of the Odysseus network, which you might know. More contributions have been or will be published in that special collection in the coming days, and I invite you to have a look on a regular basis. Many contributors to this workshop will write as well. My intervention today will focus on 4 aspects related to secondary movements. Firstly, the pitfalls of parallel political universe. The EU claims to have a common European asylum system, and yet we are confronted with 2 competing narratives. While states at the southern border, including Italy, rightly complain about the lack of solidarity and the structural unfairness of rules on asylum jurisdictions, governments further north, including Germany, often decry the absence of functioning asylum systems elsewhere and the phenomenon of secondary movements. And that means people moving irregularly to another member state after having applied for asylum elsewhere. The problem is that both are right. And that has important implications for the policy debates for 2 reasons. On the one hand, any reform, any political agreement on a reform necessarily requires a balance between more solidarity and the prevention of secondary movements. That is what the Commission hints at if it calls for a, let me quote, balance between responsibility and solidarity. On the other hand, it seems to me that a compromise on solidarity and secondary movements is an essential prerequisite for the EU and the member states to retain a basic commitment to welcoming refugees. Why? if the breakdown of mutual trust among the member states continues, states arguably have little interest of taking in any more refugees. They pass the buck to others instead of acting themselves. And if we want to overcome this vicious circle, we need to address both solidarity and secondary movements. In the blog post, which I already mentioned, I discussed driving factors from a sociological perspective in order to assess the changes in the Commission proposals. I will omit these contextual factors today and briefly discuss 3 regulatory responses only. Firstly, the carrots. As you know, states can influence the behavior of humans through both positive incentives and negative sanctions. That is the proverbial carrots and sticks. If the legislature wants to optimize compliance, it ideally combines them. So what does the Commission propose in terms of positive incentives, the carrots? The most important carrot is a wide definition of family life, including siblings, which I assume Marcello De Filippi will discuss later when he addresses Dublin. Other incentives include the consideration of meaningful links in the context of the solidarity-based relocation mechanism, which takes up a proposal of the European Parliament, which had been voiced on the previous legislative proposal. And we also have a shortened qualifying period for long-term residence status, which beneficiaries of international protections are supposed to obtain after 3 instead of 5 years. Doing so extends the statutory options for legal secondary movements, even though the practical impact of that change will probably remain limited. Why? A shorter qualifying period of 3 years does not change the substantive requirements, which include economic self-sufficiency. The Commission could arguably have embraced further options of legal onward movement, but it chose not to do so. Secondly, after the carrots, the sticks. Negative sanctions include the use of an accelerated asylum procedure in case of onward movement, both in the state in which a refugee goes and in the state to which it might be transferred back. We have also less legal remedies against transfer decision and, crucially, a reduction of social benefits to a minimum level, which is defined in a very abstract language only, which would probably imply that member states lay down varying and diverging minimum levels. It should be noted, however, that in the new proposals, that reduction in social benefits is limited in time. It seems to come to an end once jurisdiction is transferred from the state where someone first applied for asylum to the state to which he or she moved on irregularly. And this brings me, thirdly, to the very last element which I want to discuss, and through which the Commission suggests to address secondary movements, and that is, to put it a bit more provocatively, it wants to legalize them. There is a crucial difference between the debate on the 2016 proposal on a Dublin IV regulation and the new proposal. Why? The new proposals published in late September abandons the idea of a permanent or stable asylum jurisdiction. The Commission wants to continue allowing for second and third asylum applications in the European Union. In case of secondary movements, that is in case of second or third asylum applications, states must, like under the status quo, initiate a take-back procedure. And that procedure is very much streamlined with shorter time limits and, as I mentioned already, less legal remedies against transfer decision. But so the procedure will be much quicker than it is at the moment, but we still cannot expect these measures to render the largely dysfunctional take-back procedure much more effective in practice. In practice, it will very often fail like it does at the present, and that will mean, as it means now, that jurisdiction is transferred to the state where someone resides after 6 months. That is effectively what you might call the legalization of secondary movements. And I've heard that the home ministries of Germany, Austria, and the Netherlands, as well as some other countries, probably are not particularly amused about that. There are, nevertheless, and crucially, two scenarios which I myself overlooked at first reading, in which the failure of the take-back procedure does not result in a transfer of jurisdiction. So in some selected scenarios, the idea of a permanent jurisdiction is retained. The first scenario is a situation of absconding, which we have to define somehow narrowly in line with existing ECJ case law. So if someone absconds after having relocated, after having moved to another member state, that member states can transfer the person back indefinitely, even if he reappears to the authority. And secondly, and more importantly, all beneficiaries of international protection will be subject to a permanent asylum jurisdiction. So once someone has received a subsidiary protection or a refugee convention status in, let's say, Italy, and then moves on to, let's say, Germany, Germany could transfer that person back permanently. He or she will not receive a second asylum procedure in Germany. That's at least my reading of the proposal. And that raises, of course, important questions of policy coherence. If on the one hand, asylum seekers who move on, or possibly even those whose application has been rejected, receive a second asylum procedure after secondary movements, but not those who have been recognized as beneficiaries of international protection, that's a policy asymmetry which the legislature might want to address. By way of conclusion, and I hope I stick within the 12-minute rule, let me emphasize that the practical impact of the proposal, if it was adapted without major changes by the legislature, could mirror the status quo to a large extent. On the one hand, we have more solidarity, but only a little bit. And on the other hand, there are some new instruments against secondary movements, but not very strong ones. And that means that the end result within the European Union could mirror pretty much what we have at the moment. And that's, of course, disappointing, in particular, if we consider that the Commission argued in very fanciful language that this was a new pact and that it abandoned Dublin. That is quite evidently not the case. And I'm sure that Marcello will pick up on that right now. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. You've been amazing indeed, because you stuck in 10 minutes rather than 12. So it's it's quite amazing because you really said a lot, actually. You gave us a full picture, including your comments, your assessment on it, of the new rules on secondary movements, aimed at least at the prevention of secondary movements. And so I'd say that Marcello, as you mentioned, is going to address the other side of the coin here. So you explored the northern mantra, and I guess Marcello is going to explore the southern mantra now, and to tell us about the proposal of the Commission concerning the allocation of the criteria, the Dublin criteria, the allocation criteria for allocation of refugees under the new proposal, and also about his assessment on it. Thank you, Marcello, and I'm glad to give you the floor.
Thank you, Manuela. Also, I thank Daniel for having been so excellent in managing the time. I hope to be as efficient as Daniel was. And first of all, let me congratulate the organizers for having set up this wonderful conference, having allowed me to regain contact with many colleagues and friends that I lost of sight in the last 1 year or 2 years. It's a really pleasure for me and an honor. I hope to give you some interesting remarks about this so-called new pact on migration and asylum, especially for the issue of the choice of criteria that govern the allocation of responsibility of competence among the various member states. it's compulsory for me to take many things for granted. I hope the audience will be able to follow me, because if I start making a series of introduction remarks on anything that I will going to say, I think I will need 1 hour or more. So I will take many things for granted, and I suggest to person that could not catch everything to follow the excellent blog that already Daniel remembered, the blog of the sales network, even the blog of ADiM that is younger, but it's becoming important in the general debate. And also, if you have time, if you still have time, even the observatory on EU migration law that I try to manage here in the University of Pisa, in order of importance and also of relevance. Well, we all know that since 2015, more or less, with the agenda on migration, and more recently with the declaration by the President von der Leyen and also by several commissioners, we were expecting something really new on many aspects, but especially on the contested and inefficient Dublin system. Dublin has repeatedly stated that, or changed, substituted with new rules, with a new logic, with a new approach? Absolutely not. I think this is one thing on which we all can agree. The system has not completely changed. Okay, maybe the Dublin terminology will disappear. This is already something good, but the rules are essentially the same. So Dublin is maybe Francesco, if I'm not Francesco Magnani, maybe wrote in his blog, is the undying or the Highlander, like Christopher Lambert in the picture in the movie Highlander, never dies. Maybe changes the name, but Dublin is still there. So let's give a brief look at the contents of the main proposal that has to see with the allocation criteria for deciding which is the member state responsible for deciding, for examining the application for asylum. It's the regulation on asylum migration management, the regulation M, or I would say you have to be calm when you read this regulation, because it's largely disappointing if you are a person who is following this topic since many years, and you perfectly know that there is a big amount of literature, of reports, of studies on the ground that demonstrate that the Dublin fabric doesn't work. It's perfectly right, Daniel, before underlining that Dublin didn't work for the interest of states of frontline states of preferred or favorite destination, like Germany, for asylum seekers. Is not good. This system, this set of rules is not appreciated by asylum seekers. There is much discontent about Dublin. Maybe some actors are more unhappy with some aspects. Other actors are more critical towards other points of the Dublin system, but the Dublin fabric doesn't work, okay? I think this is out of discussion. So it should be changed, taking one way or another. And it's quite surprising for me, maybe because I still believe in the capacity of the European Commission to act as a supranational institution, not only a negotiator between the competing views of member states. This is not for the Commission. I mean, this is not the exclusive role for the Commission. The Commission must be realistic, of course. It must be taken. The Commission must take into account the political orientation of the Council, of the European Council, of course, even the signals coming from the various blocks of member states. But the Commission must not be prisoner of the demands of the member states only. The Commission must pay very high attention to the desire, to the political will of the European Parliament, but also of other stakeholders, because the Commission must pursue the general interest of the European Union, must try to put in practice the principles of EU law, Article 80, for instance, Article 78 in any word, Okay, but it seems to me that this commission, like the previous one, especially in the second part of its mandate, is completely submerged by political realism without any ambition. Let me be very, very direct and frank. Of course, I don't want to say that everything in the regulation that I'm commenting is bad or is ill-conceived. But as a general judgment, we could have expected much more, especially because the European Parliament, with a large majority, a little time ago, underlined the need of a radical change of approach. Okay, some states are not willing to follow this line, but again, the Commission has not only the member states as principal point of reference. So which are the content? Well, the Dublin criteria are maintained more or less, and especially the very debatable criterion of country of first entry, even irregular. There are some adjustments, there is some maquillage. For instance, the family links are revised in a way that now siblings will be included, as Daniel already anticipated. Siblings are in a stable way family member to take into account as a connecting factor. Okay, well, finally, I would say what it was strange is that since the Dublin Convention, this criterion was not used, or let me say it better, this part of the family of an asylum seeker was ignored in order to determine which was the right member state or the member state best placed to conduct the refugee status determination procedure. So, okay, the sibling, but let's not be satisfied with just this novelty, because it's very little novelty. It was really criticizable that before this category of family member was not included. And then regarding family links, take into account that still there is still a big difference between the asylum seeker who is an accompanied minor and the asylum seeker who is 18 years old, 19 years old, 20 years old, and so on, who is adult, because the scope of the concept of family members changes. For an accompanied minor, there is a more liberal approach, but if you are 18 or more years old, well, the number or the typology of family members that you can invoke in order to say, Ireland is my right Dublin state, or Germany, or France, or Italy, or Portugal. Well, if you're adult, well, the number of family members that you can invoke is really reduced. And this is really hard to understand. Think if you have your father or your mother, but you are 20 years old and your mother is currently hosted in Sweden and you are 20 years old, this is not enough in order to determine automatically that Sweden is the competent state under this Dublin type fabric. So I think that on family links, much more could be done. Even because there are situations where it's hard to understand the difference between a boy of 16 years and a young adult of 20 years old, especially when...
I tell you that you have 2 minutes left.
Sorry?
You have 2 minutes left.
2 minutes left, okay, excellent. Or not, for me. Another thing I would like to underline that there is another novelty in the identification of allocation criteria is the fact that the asylum seeker has got a diploma or a professional qualification in a member state. This is considered to be a meaningful link. This is okay. Okay, for sure. Like it's good, the criteria to make it more liberal, the criterion on a previous legal abode. This is fine, but I think regarding study, for instance, period of study in Europe, there could be different typologies of academic contact between third country national and our system of education, like for instance, international mobility or double degrees released by a European university and, for instance, an African university, and maybe courses given at distance in streaming like now. So why not considering even those factors? It's easy to assess who is the person. It's easy to assess if this link is existent. Then there is another point that is interesting. You know that Italy for a long time asked that the persons disembarked after irregular arrivals by sea are considered to enter Europe, not only Italy, especially for the purpose of determining which is the state that is responsible for asylum procedures, or even for management of those persons. Well, there is some concession in this proposal to demands of frontline countries, but is this enough? I don't think so, because the kind of support that is given or is foreseen for state accepting disembarkation is not so clear in its impact on the burden that states accepting disembarkation undergo. So we should have I think Violeta later will discuss it, but I'm not truly convinced that this is the right answer to an existing problem. It's just a start. We will have to work better on it. And let me concentrate now on two aspects very quickly. Maintaining the old logic of Dublin.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I really cannot give you this extra time. I've been really Mario is laughing if you look at him in the screen because he asked me to be extremely strict on speakers. So I really apologize. And
I stop here if you want, no problem.
I'm really sorry. I hope you'll have the chance to further discuss this point, these two aspects you were going to highlight during the debate. And so if you text me what you were about to talk, I will take care of asking you a question about that. I'm joking, of course, but not fully joking. And so I'm now glad to give the floor to Lilian Sturdy, who will address a very key aspect, I think, of the reform, which I hope is not so disappointing as the two other points turned out to be, in the words of Daniel and in the words of Marcello, which is the role of one special agency, which should have a major role in this reform, which is the European Asylum Support Office. Please, Lilian. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. And I would like to also thank the organizers for bringing together this conference with a great lineup of speakers and discussion. I'm not speaking about myself, but the rest always. And as already the Odysseus network line of and series of blog posts was mentioned, I also wanted to say that I will be drawing in my presentation today from this same series with a blog post that has been published just today. And as credit should be given where credit is due, this whole series is spearheaded also by Daniel Tim, whom you heard at the beginning of this session, we should say. So in my presentation, I will focus on the role of one agency, which is EASO, but maybe I will speak also some observations about agencyfication in the new Pact more broadly. So a starting point to analyze developments, specifically also in border procedures, but more broadly, are these two trends in the workings of agencies that actually preceded the Pact. The first was a passage from practical cooperation, which was the initial bread and butter of EU agencies, including EASO, towards joint implementation. And the second is the emergence of monitoring and steering functions. So this joint implementation, we have connected it most often with the agency Frontex at the external borders, joint operations, etc., etc. But what has been the development is that since 2016, we have had actually this passage and the emergence of patterns of joint implementation also in what concerns the field of asylum and specifically through EASO. So this has happened not de jure, so nothing has changed from EASO's regulation of 2010, which actually excludes in a very broad phrasing, direct or indirect powers in relation to the taking of decisions by member states. It has actually happened de facto, and why border procedures are so important is that it first emerged in a national variant of border procedures in Greece. So Greek law actually introduced accelerated and border procedures in 2016. And they included an admissibility stage. What was to be decided in this admissibility stage is the application of a safe third country, and thinking of the context, of course, we understand that this concerns returns from Greece to Turkey under the designation of a safe third country. So where EASO came into that is that, in fact, deployed experts through EASO started undertaking part in this assessment, initially at admissibility. So specifically, what they are doing is that they are conducting independently the admissibility interviews, and then they emit a non-binding opinion to the Greek Asylum Service. So it is, in fact, in the end, the decision formally emanates from the Greek Asylum Service, but of course, this admissibility interview and this opinion of EASO is very weighty. That does not mean that we have seen also in Greece full rubber stamping of these decisions. So the Greek Asylum Service has overturned them, specifically in what concerns the returns of non-Syrian asylum seekers in Turkey because they are excluded from this temporary protection regulation that exists under Turkish law, which is the only equivalent that we can say exists to something akin to protection. But while they have not, of course, been just merely rubber stamped, they are very influential. And then with further amendments to the Greek law, this kind of involvement of EASO is now also taking place at the merits. So deployed experts undertaking interviews and again emitting a non-binding opinion to the Greek Asylum Service. I will not linger due to the time and due to the focus that has been given to me, which was the border procedures, a lot on monitoring functions. This exists already in the agency Frontex, so I'm referring to the vulnerability assessments, which assesses capacities of member states to conduct external border controls. And there are, when there are, let's say, weaknesses, they are remediated also through deployments. For example, such an envisaged monitoring mechanism would be part of the future European Union Agency on Asylum, but it is not actually for the moment operational. So what happens in the Pact? Where are we legislatively with EASO? Because I told you that all these developments have happened de facto, so on the basis of Greek national law, but nothing has shifted legally since 2010, and this exclusion of even indirect powers for EASO. So the current regulation is not attuned to the administrative realities, and arguably the agency is acting beyond its mandate. So we have had an initial proposal for a European Union agency on asylum of 2016. There was a political agreement on this basis on several chapters, but not all of it, in 2017. And then there were some further targeted amendments that the Commission presented in 2018. There was no new consolidated or streamlined proposal as part of the Pact. Actually, the co-legislators were left and incited actually to reach a quick, swift agreement on the basis of the text of 2016 and this interim political agreement of late 2017. I personally find this to be problematic because the 2016 instrument, we all know that EASO is having key roles also operationally and in implementing intra-EU solidarity. This 2016 instrument actually, and the 2017 proposal, correlates to the previous round of legislative proposals and the Dublin IV approach. So actually, the co-legislators have been left alone to consolidate these texts with the new entire, if you want, philosophy of the new pact. And we will hear more on that, on the solidarity measures from Francesco. As well as the fact was that blockages existed before, specifically due to the correlation of solidarity and monitoring. So member states at the external borders did not want to accept further monitoring functions for the agency before they had concrete guarantees on solidarity. And of course, this will not be offered in the next 2-3 months because they correlate with the new instruments that have actually been proposed that will now enter slowly the negotiation procedures. So if this is the legal situation, what about the Pact instruments themselves? And here the organizers have also asked me to focus on border procedures, which is something that I also do in the blog that I mentioned. So it is my opinion that the Pact legal instruments do not satisfactorily embed these new functions of EU agencies, and on EASO I am referring to these joint implementation functions, and this is very well illustrated through the instruments, so the Asylum Procedures Regulation, which has some targeted amendments vis-a-vis the previous instrument. One of them is this border procedure, and we saw what a seminal role EASO has been playing in Greece, one of the countries which will very much actually be in the focus of these border procedures, also in terms of capacity issues and structural issues. And here we just have a passing mention, not even in the main text, but only in the explanatory memorandum, of how EASO as well can support member states with staff within its mandate. Yes, indeed, its new mandate, when adopted, will engrain this possibility of common processing, but the fact that there is nothing else mentioned explicitly in the regulation means that we do not have any proper reflection of the procedural implications of these deployed experts and of the EU level in these procedures. And this has an impact both on the procedural rights of applicants, but also on the type of accountability arrangements that may exist.
I'm sorry, short of time, may you please conclude?
Yes, yes, and I had my own clock that I had put here, so so I was coming to that. So this would be, in terms of border procedures, the main conclusion, that what we see is that although the communication on the Pact actually declares the importance of the new operational roles of EU agencies, we see that in the instruments themselves, there has not been in the legal design any particular thoughts of the procedural fundamental rights, let's say, implications, and of perhaps novel accountability arrangements in order to actually account for these new roles. So I stop here and then we can continue in the question time. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Excellent timing. Sorry for interrupting you, but of course I didn't know that you had a watch yourself, a clocking time. So it's thanks a lot for your observations and for your analysis of what would have been the expectations for EASO and what the actual proposals is about. And now it is time for Francesco Maiani from the University of Lausanne. And Francesco is going to address a key point of the proposal concerning the core of solidarity, of the new solidarity. This is the way it has been presented by the Commission. And so return, sponsorship, and relocation. Thank you, Francesco, and I'm very glad to give you the floor.
Thank you very much. Like Lilian, I will time my presentation. So if I go wrong, I will not be far wrong. Of course, it's difficult to present something as complex and as contentious as the new solidarity mechanism in 12 minutes, but that's the same thing that applies to all the speakers today. And there are, of course, I will not try to be exhaustive in any way. There are many aspects that I leave for our discussion later on. Let me start from a political premise, and this is, I am quoting the Commission. It's not the opinion of some crazy extremist academic observer. I quote the Commission when I say that there is no effective solidarity mechanism in place right now. And as Daniel pointed out so rightly, having one is a basic prerequisite for the functioning of the common European asylum system. And that this is not because of, you know, fuzzy or contestable moral principles of solidarity. There is one very hard fact that is before us, and that has been before us for the past 20 years. Without a good insurance scheme, member states are pushed to defend their national interests by unilateral measures that in turn not only lower the standards, sometimes unacceptably, but also erode completely mutual trust, which is a precondition for the functioning of the whole construct. So without effective solidarity, you have a system that operates badly and that breaks down in a crisis. And as you rightly pointed out, and as Marcello and all those who came before us pointed out, the big expectation from the new pact was to have a new solidarity mechanism. And in fact, if you read the communication, the new solidarity mechanism is really pushed as the big innovation. And we will see how much innovation there is, but that is not per se important, how much problems the new provisions would address. But before getting there, I mean, it's extremely complicated, and I think it is worthwhile to spend a couple of minutes on the basic features of the mechanism. The mechanism, as foreseen in the migration management proposal, is set to operate in 3 different modes as a mechanism that works for after search and rescue operations when there are recurring arrivals to a member state, when a member state is under pressure, and finally, when there is a situation of crisis affecting a member state. I will not go in the nuances of the three modes, but I would like to recall some of the basic aspects of how the mechanism is set to work in the proposal. First of all, the Commission has the trigger in hand. It is up to the Commission to determine whether either of the three modes is applicable, and it is remarkable how much discretion de facto the Commission has in deciding whether the mechanism should start operating. Secondly, it is the Commission who makes the determination of the solidarity needs in each one of these situations. So it is up to the Commission, sure, after consulting with the member state concerned, but it is up to the Commission to determine how many relocations are needed or how many other contributions, let's call it like that, which may be, you know, deploying operational solidarity, deploying funds in order to make capacity building, et cetera, et cetera. The Commission maps out the needs and sets out the blueprint of the solidarity measures that are going to be taken. And once that is done, and again, I stress the level of discretion that the Commission has, there is a pledging mechanism. I mean, member state will respond to the requests of the Commission by making pledges. And then if the Commission says it's good, then it's done. We have a solidarity pool from which the beneficiary state can draw. If not, we start another negotiating process. And it boils down, the bottom line is that if the solidarity contributions offered in terms of relocation fall short by 30% of what was proposed by the Commission, then member states have to offer at least 50% of the relocation needs. This is a very significant point because when we say that it's a system of mandatory solidarity, well, in terms of the relocations offered, what the Commission is proposing is that it sets the need at 100, member state must at least respond to 50, okay? This is an important feature of the system. The other important feature of the system is that relocation needs may be met either via relocation or via return sponsorship. I won't enter into what return sponsorship is in broad strokes because you all know having read the proposal, okay? On that basis, you have a solidarity pool, which then is activated, and depending on the various modes of the mechanism, you will have different eligibility circles that are defined. The very basic one is that protection seekers that are not subject to a border procedure are eligible for relocation, and that persons who are subject to a return decision are eligible for return sponsorship. As things get thicker with pressure or crisis, the eligibility scope is enlarged. Then you have matching, and then you have the transfers that take place mostly like under Dublin. So this is in very broad outline how the mechanism is designed. And I would like to offer my reflections on this guided by two questions. The first question derives directly from what I said at the beginning. Europe needs a good insurance plan. And the question is whether this is an insurance plan that could convince member states to buy it, especially the member states that were mostly under pressure. And I don't mean only the border states, but as statistics evince, it's a handful of states that are both on the border or traditional destinations. So I don't think it's a very convincing insurance plan. It's better than what we have in some ways, but it's not a very convincing insurance plan. First of all, because of the scope. I mean, the fact that persons undergoing border procedures are excluded might reduce the usefulness of the scheme, or at the very least, induce member states to use very little the border procedures. So there is kind of a conflict of aims from the point of view of the Commission here. The second point is that the benefiting member state still faces a whole series of hidden costs that are not entirely offset by the mechanism. So there is the first screening, there is registration of the requests, there is the first reception, which may stretch for as long as the person is awaiting to be transferred or relocated. And all of this could also hamper the practical application of the mechanism, not to mention the fact that there has to be a first Dublin-like determination of which criteria would apply already at the first stage. So, of course, these costs sink as we go into crisis mode, because crisis mode requires a lot less prerequisite on the part of the beneficiary state, but still there is this to consider. Then there is the other element that, of course, if we consider that the Commission defines the needs correctly, well, the insurance scheme covers 50% of those needs when, you know, when push comes to shove, because member states finally have to guarantee that. And also, there is one striking feature is about what has to be covered in return sponsorship. This that you are seeing now is the relevant provision. And as you see, the return sponsor, for the time that return procedure are carried out by the beneficiary state, has to support the beneficiary state. But that support can also be just, you know, providing counseling on return. So if I were the beneficiary state, I would be very much in doubt whether it's a very good insurance scheme, because the sponsor state can get away with very little in terms of the costs that they have to share. Of course, they incur the risk of having the person transferred to them after 8 months, but 8 months of, you know, possibly detention and all that will all be on the budget of the beneficiary state. Final point, the thing is that I'm not sure that it's a very predictable scheme. And predictability is very important when you talk about a good insurance scheme. There is a lot of Commission discretion, both in whether the system has to be triggered and on the level of support available. There is the risk that the system grinds to a halt, which is something that we have seen with all the relocation schemes that we have had in the past, is entirely borne by the beneficiary state. I mean, if transfers come to a halt for bureaucratic reasons, etc., or slow down, well, the pressure will accumulate on the territory of the beneficiary state. And in light of past experience, this is far from being a far-fetched scenario. And then there are rules on force majeure that I have no time absolutely to go into, but which basically allow member states to opt out of the solidarity system for up to 6 months, just by arguing that they're in a situation that does not allow them to, you know, go along with the game. So it's not a very predictable system. The second question I want to ask, and I see that I have just 1 minute to answer it, but I hope that I will have perhaps 1 minute more, given the complexity of the task that was assigned to me, is whether this is likely to work in practice. So the immediate precedent that we have is Dublin and the relocation, and actually both point to the fact that involuntariness and bureaucratic heaviness or bureaucratic complexity are major factors that slow down or determine the unsuccess of such schemes. And in this case, you have both. First of all, there is no hint at the fact that applicants are actors of the system. They have to be matched based on meaningful links, but you know, this is extremely vague. So a good number of the transfer risks being involuntary and coercive. And the second thing is that the administrative complexity is remarkable. I have counted that before a person gets in the asylum procedure, which is the baseline, you have a first fragment of a Dublin procedure in the beneficiary state, you have matching, then you have the relocation, then you have a second Dublin procedure in the state of transfer, and possibly a second transfer. And only persons who are unfamiliar with how complicated it can be to transfer somebody can, you know, look at this and be relaxed about the possibility that this could work in practice. I finished with my consideration. I will just have a concluding remark. In my latest contribution, you may agree or not, but in my latest contribution, I had pointed out 3 needs that needed to be addressed in order to really change things. And I'm not alone in this. I mean, Elspeth Guild and Violetta had concluded much to the same idea. you need to enlist the cooperation of applicants to a much larger extent. You need to radically simplify the system, render it less bureaucratic, and probably involve the agencies a lot more, like Lillian pointed out. And you need to have predictable solidarity. In my view, none of these benchmarks is met. What we have is rather very much in the sense of what Marcello pointed out, a very good example of path dependency and muddling through, where the Commission, instead of really trying to devise a system that relies on a robust understanding of the common European interest, has tried to make concessions here and there in order to ensure that it is at least apparent that something is being done. In my view, this is not enough by far to meet the very complicated challenge of having a significant and functioning solidarity system. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Francesco. You've been in time also, and thank you for making this effort, which is quite important for this workshop to work properly, since we are online and it's not very easy to follow a very long session. And well, I understand that your theme, your topic, will be very much developed in the next session, actually, where person working on the proposals will have the possibility to debate with us on the perspectives they see about.
I'll be along until 6:30. So when we discuss of this, I'll be here.
Okay, so it's well, in my understanding, there will be quite some debate on this point in the next session. So it's now time for Professor Kees Gronindek, and I apologize for not pronouncing his name properly. I'm not sure I did. Professor Kees Gronindek is from the University of Radboud, and he's going to address a completely different topic, which is neglected which has been neglected so far in the previous years in the application of the existing legal tools on the common asylum system, which is temporary protection. I leave you the floor, Professor Gronindek. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you. First of all, to the organizers for inviting me to participate and creating this opportunity to meet, or at least see, a lot of old friends in this exceptional times. That's a very positive thing. I'm afraid I will disappoint the chairperson who started off with the question, will there be real change? I'm afraid that my answer will be in the negative. With respect to the other speakers, I think my task is easier, because basically I will focus on two elements of the Commission's proposal on regulation on addressing the situations of crisis and force majeure. The proposal to repeal the Temporary Protection Directive in Article 14 of that proposal, and to replace it by one article, Article 10, with what they call immediate protection. Now, the Temporary Protection Directive of 2001 was one of the first EU asylum and migration instruments adopted on the basis of the Treaty of Amsterdam. And the main reason why it was so an early document was at that time the feeling of shame that the EU had been unable to agree on common action regarding the refugees from the war in Bosnia, and also from the conflict in Kosovo in 1999. And the idea behind the Temporary Protection Directive was to rapidly relieve the pressure on asylum systems by collectively granting protection status and postpone individual decision making. And I think here's the important caveat with all temporary protection systems, is that both politicians in the receiving countries and refugees tend to think that protection needs are temporary and underestimate the speed with which international conflict or national conflict that creates the need for international protections will end. The main elements of the Temporary Protection Directive was that the Council, in situations of mass influx, could unanimously decide that certain groups of asylum seekers were in need of temporary protection. The directive, secondly, contains a set of rights that were almost equal to the rights of refugees. That status could be used for a maximum of 3 years, and in the directive also was the first chapter with rules on solidarity, but those rules were basically basically created a completely voluntary scheme and provided also for financial support. The directive was never used in practice. Several times member states proposed using the scheme. Sweden and other member states in 2007 with regard to refugees from Iraq, and Malta and Italy in 2011 with respect to refugees from the war in Libya. But both times they got insufficient support or no support at all in the Council. Why was there never sufficient support in the Council? First, because of the requirement of unanimity. And that was also the reason that the Commission never made proposals, because they knew that they would not get the required unanimity. But I think there's also another element that explains why member states were not willing to go with the proposals of other member states who wanted to introduce the temporary protection scheme. That is that member states considered the level of rights granted to the beneficiaries of temporary protection to be too high. And two elements were important in my view, that the directive contained a right to family reunification and a right to immediate access to the labor market, so access to employment. That made member states prefer national solutions. And of course, the different positions with regard to both politically and geographically to the source of the migration, the refugee movement played a role too. Now, what are the main differences between the never used temporary protection directive scheme and the immediate protection scheme proposed in Article 10 of the directive on crisis situations and force majeure? First, it's the Commission and no longer the Council that decides in an implementing act whether there is a crisis situation. So no longer unanimity in the Council is needed. Secondly, member states may suspend examination of asylum requests for this group of asylum seekers, but should immediately grant asylum seekers the same rights as the beneficiaries of subsidiary protection under the Qualification Directive. The third difference is that the implication of granting beneficiary status rather than something near to the refugee status is that there will be no right to family reunification. The Commission proposal speaks about family unity, but that's clearly misleading because family unity in the legal terminology doesn't imply the right to family reunification. And the fourth important difference is that this scheme could only last for a maximum of 1 year rather than 3 years. After 1 year, the member state has to resume examination of the individual asylum requests. Now, my prediction is that the immediate protection scheme of Article 10 will, just like the Temporary Protection Directive, never be applied in practice. It's not difficult for member states to agree to Article 10, but since it doesn't put in any obligation to apply it in practice, this doesn't involve anything. And I fully agree with Steve Pear's conclusion in his first analysis of the new Pact, is that it's easy to agree and never apply it in practice. Now, why will immediate protection of Article 10 not work in practice? Firstly, it will be a very difficult decision for the European Commission. And member states will surely, in the comitology procedures, try to influence the decision if the Commission ever would start on it. Secondly, the question is, why should a member state use Article 10 rather than simply grant the status of subsidiary protection without the need to resume the asylum procedures after 1 year? I mean, this is exactly what Germany did after the spring of 2016 with most of the Syrian refugees, grant them subsidiary protection status rather than the refugee status. Or a member state can choose as an alternative to grant national temporary protection status and regulate family reunification and access to employment on the basis of national law. Of course, I may be wrong, that the European Commission will be more courageous and will make an implementing decision. And once that this decision has been made on the EU level, refugee organizations or NGOs might be able to campaign for using this status on the basis of the decision made by the Commission. And some member states might give in to that pressure and voluntarily agree to subject themselves to the EU rules and the checks involved with using EU rules, but immediately issue rights equivalent to the beneficiary protection status, but also then accept the obligation to resume examination of the original asylum request after a year. And I don't think that this political reaction is very likely. It's highly unlikely in my view. And my cynical conclusion is that the immediate protection status introduced in Article 10 of this proposal is a kind of pacifier, a symbolic compensation for 2 chapters in the same proposal who are full of reduction of political guarantee, procedural guarantees for asylum seekers in crisis situations, and considerably increase the risk of refoulement due to the greatly extended use of border procedures that will become possible on the basis of this proposal. So very little change otherwise than kind of justifying, legitimizing very bad elements in the same proposal for the same regulation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your speech, for casting light on this part of the proposal, which, at least to my knowledge, had not yet been explored extensively so far, and which has quite a potential, though, or had a potential at least. And also thank you for being so tight with your timing, which is more important if we're in an online conference than usual. So now we have the last speaker in this session, who is Violeta Moreno-Lax from Queen Mary University, and she has also quite a key topic at least for part of this audience here, because she's going to address the new approach. So she's going actually to explore whether there is a new approach in the search and rescue mechanism here in this new proposal. So I'm very happy to give you the floor, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yes, okay. Right, so thanks a lot for the invitation, and I'd like to also say that I'll be relying on my forthcoming post for the Odysseus blog series. I'll be structuring my presentation in 3 parts. First, the background to a crisis that I think it's of our own making. Then the current Commission proposals in terms of rescue, disembarkation, and relocation arrangements. And then I'd like to focus on the implications for both migrants and the search and rescue NGOs, which I'm going to refer to as SAR NGOs. So the origins of the boat migration crisis, I think, lie in a number of factors, starting with the drastic reduction of SAR capacity by EU coastal member states in the Mediterranean from the 2010s, leading to the mass drownings that we've seen in Lampedusa since 2013, for instance, which led to the Italian Mare Nostrum operation in 2014, withdrawn 1 year after and replaced with Frontex coordinated border control rather than rescue operations. Gaps in SAR capacity were met with increased death rates, and the Commission mentions IOM data counting over 20,000 deaths since 2014, which is a considerable number. Search and rescue NGOs emerged actually as a result of these deaths and as a result of this decreased or reduction of SAR capacity to try to fill the gaps in SAR provision. Although their presence was initially welcomed and their cooperation with the Italian, Maltese, and Greek Coast Guards ran smoothly for a period of time, things changed in 2017 when the Italian government signed the infamous Memorandum of Understanding with Libya, followed by the controversial Code of Conduct for NGOs, undertaking activities in migrants' rescue operation at sea, which among other things required them not to obstruct search and rescue operations by official Coast Guard vessels, including the Libyan Coast Guard. And I'm quoting paragraph 9 of the Code of Conduct. And these followed by the criminalization of the Juventa crew and the impoundment of their vessel in August 2017 after Jugendrettet, which was the owner, is the owner of the Juventa vessel, refused to sign the code. The wave of criminalization of SAR organizations and the delegitimization of maritime arrivals was reinforced once Salvini became Interior Minister in the summer of 2018, when he adopted a special security decree implementing what was called the closed ports policy, banning search and rescue organizations from entering Italian ports and disembarking survivors, regardless of Italy's obligations under EU and international law. This triggered a series of crises whereby rescues were left incomplete until voluntary ad hoc solutions, including relocation to other member states, would have been agreed in intergovernmental and typically secret negotiations brokered by the European Commission. The unsubstantiated belief that rescue at sea creates a pull factor, which is exploited by smugglers and traffickers, has fed into this dynamic, despite wide-ranging research dispelling the claim based on data generated not least by Frontex and the UNAFOR-Med Operation Sophia. An important detail to bear in mind in this framework, I think, is that these crises have on average concerned a maximum of 600 individuals at a time, which I think can hardly be said to overwhelm the overall asylum and return capacities of any member state. Whatever your conclusion might be, it is against this background that a first attempt to put an end to the ship-by-ship arrangements was made with the Malta Declaration in September 2019, aiming for a structural Europeanized solution that would make the system more stable and predictable. The outcome, however, was meager and failed to bring the scheme within the EU legal framework, instead reinforcing the trend of informal solutions and legitimizing the actions by the Italian government endorsing both the memorandum with Libya and the Code of Conduct for NGOs, despite harsh criticism, including by the Council of Europe Commissioner for Human Rights, UNHCR, and the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, alongside multiple other organizations. So what is it now that is being proposed? To avoid a repeat of the closed ports scenario, the Commission is proposing a common European approach to SAR, but it fails to thoroughly address rescue and disembarkation arrangements, which, however, were considered pillars of the Malta Declaration Initiative. The novelty lies in the solidarity relocation system proposed as part of the Migration Management Regulation, which Francesco Maiani has already discussed, and I'm going not to dwell into too much. So in terms of rescue, the proposal adds nothing to the current EU rescue response in the Mediterranean, limiting itself to acknowledging that rescue is an obligation under international law, and also a key element of the integrated border management system of the European Union to be implemented as a shared responsibility by Frontex and national authorities. It simply states that Frontex should provide increased operational and technical support within EU competence, omitting the fact that Frontex has no specific mandate to engage in proactive search and rescue, and has in the very recent past been confronted with allegations of failure to respond to distress calls and to properly contribute to rescue operations. On the contrary, the SAR recommendation appears to rely on the increased rescue capacity stemming from the involvement of private and commercial vessels, including those operated by NGOs, praising the significant contributions from coastal member states and Frontex without calling on them for any additional contributions. At the same time, the SAR recommendation contains a veiled critique of NGO rescues. First, the SAR recommendation embraces the pull factor rhetoric when stating that it is essential to avoid a situation in which migrant smuggling or human trafficking networks take advantage of the rescue operations conducted by private vessels. It isn't clear whether this means that rescue should not be performed if it would thereby jeopardize effective migration management as intended by the European Commission. Be it as it may, the foreseeable impact of the SAR recommendation, rather than increasing SAR capacity, may well be the opposite, by subjecting search and rescue NGO vessels to strict scrutiny, using safety of navigation as an excuse to police their activity. There are several measures which have been characterized as forms of criminalization of humanitarian assistance in the broad sense that are now proposed in the SAR recommendation for this purpose. So on the premise that SAR NGOs may conduct consecutive rescue operations before disembarking survivors and act on their own motion rather than at the behest of a maritime rescue coordination center, the Commission feels that this requires special rules of control, even though this behavior in reality is in perfect conformity with international maritime conventions and the law of the sea. Because SAR NGOs may conduct large and complex rescues, there appears to be an assumption that these may give per se and without further substantiation may give rise to a public policy or safety concern, justifying a need for close policing and close scrutiny of search and rescue NGO vessels, making sure that they are suitably registered and properly equipped. And it's quite telling that the same does not apply to the Libyan Coast Guard vessels with which Italy, Malta, and the European Union routinely cooperates. In terms of disembarkation, there is no proposal to clarify where survivors should be disembarked when rescued within operations that are not coordinated by Frontex, which is the only case regulated under EU law in the Sea Borders Regulation of 2014, to which the Commission makes no reference whatsoever. Rather than attempting a clarification, the Commission refers to strengthened cooperation with countries of origin and transit to prevent irregular crossings. And although there is no reference directly to Libya, this is the country of provenance of most rescued persons disembarked in the EU. It is striking that there is no discussion of the human rights implications here, considering the appalling record of violations against migrants at sea in Libya and by the Libyan Coast Guard itself. it is also striking that the proposal completely disregards the EU's and the member states' own extraterritorial obligations vis-a-vis their country nationals, including concerning the right to leave any country, the right to seek asylum, and the right to protection from torture, ill treatment, and refoulement. Right, in terms of relocation, if disembarkation takes place in an EU member state, there is a specific system of solidarity relocations, which can become compulsory in certain situations of crisis. This has already been explained by Mayani, and so I'm not going to repeat his observations, but there are a couple of comments that I'd like to make. First of all, it is unclear what happens if a member state fails to engage with the SAR Solidarity Response Plan drawn by the Commission. It is unclear what happens if it persists in its defection and doesn't comply with the Commission indications. What if there are conflicts between member states? This is also unclear. Or if they contest the way in which their quotas have been calculated. There are also no conciliation procedures or sanctions envisaged in such cases. It is also unclear how long the Solidarity Forum may deliberate for and under which rules. This may defeat the object of rapid relocations. The system depends, above all, on constant negotiation and relies on an amount of good faith and mutual trust between the member states that I do not think exists. What also we do not know is how concurrent situations of recurrent arrivals or migratory pressure or crisis should be reconciled. So what happens if many member states declare themselves under pressure or in a crisis at the same time? How are we going to cope in those situations? Overall, it seems unrealistic, I think, to expect member states to cede the required power to the Commission that Mayani was mentioning to force their hand into accepting relocations. A repeat of the infringement proceedings against the Visegrad states can therefore not be discarded. The proposal, in fact, concentrates the power to make all the key decisions in the hands of the Commission, to decide what the solidarity needs are, how they should be distributed, whether member states are confronted with recurrent arrivals, pressure, or a crisis, and how solidarity contributions should be calculated and which shape they should ultimately take. All of this, I think, will fail at the negotiation stage within the Council. An extra complication stems from the force majeure framework. We do not know what will happen if a majority of member states unilaterally declare themselves to face a force majeure situation, such as a second wave of the COVID pandemic, for example. This, in effect, will put on hold solidarity mechanisms for up to half a year and exempt member states from Dublin transfers for an indefinite amount of time, all of which will paralyze the system and lead to a legalized form of fragmentation and defection, which could lead to a de facto deharmonization of the legal and policy framework. In terms of implications, while it is open to discussion who the winners and losers of the scheme are going to be, I think there are some observations that merit to be made, particularly in relation to the applicants that are going to be supposed beneficiaries of the scheme and the search and rescue organizations themselves. So, although one may think that relocations will be a good thing for the individuals concerned, it is striking that their agency, voice, preferences are not going to be taken into account in any way. Although they will be able to oppose a relocation on the same limited basis as they could challenge a Dublin transfer, it is unclear the extent to which family links and other relevant connections to particular member states will indeed be taken in consideration, considering the swiftness with which the pre-screening and relocation procedures are supposed to happen. This may boost the much despised secondary movements that Daniel Tim has discussed. Another issue that the European Commission fails to address is the potential incompatibility of these arrangements with Article 3 of the Geneva Convention, which forbids discrimination amongst refugees. The system, however, singles out maritime rescuees on the basis of their mode of arrival to the potential country of refuge, putting them at a potential disadvantage on grounds that are unrelated to their protection needs. And this, I think, is in contravention of the Geneva Convention. Coming to my final points, the implications for SAR NGOs which I have already partly mentioned above. I think that the system that is proposed by the Commission encloses a paradox. On the one hand, it relies on the enhanced search and rescue capacity represented by private vessels operating in the Mediterranean, while on the other hand, it raises suspicion of their activities, which it attempts to control, police, and ultimately suppress to the maximum extent. This is particularly evident from the manner in which the European Commission guidance against criminalization of humanitarian assistance has been framed. I need one more minute, if you don't mind. So the European Commission does express the view that Article 1 of the Facilitation Directive must be interpreted so that humanitarian assistance that is mandated by law, presumably including rescue at sea, cannot and must not be criminalized, but it fails to provide examples of what should be framed as humanitarian assistance or when should it be considered as being mandated by law. Then it states that the criminalization of NGOs that carry out SAR operations at sea amounts to a breach of international law and therefore is not permitted under EU law. But it caveats the provision to cover only rescue operations conducted while complying with the relevant legal framework, which I think leaves ample margin for speculation. The final assessment in the view of the Commission pertains to the judicial authorities of the member states, which will have to strike the right balance, and I'm quoting from the guidance, between the different interests and values at play, as if the right to life or the protection against refoulement admitted such a balancing. This means that the practices of policing and criminalization of SAR organization witnessed since 2017 may continue unabated. It will only be in the courts that their activities may ultimately be decriminalized. But the strategy of persecution by prosecution used in Italy and Greece against Sea-Watch, ProMaid, or Team Humanity can and will foreseeably continue to be applied. All in all, and this is my final conclusion, the Commission plan leaves much to be desired. It structuralizes the current practices, including those whose legitimacy and legality have been challenged in national and European courts. And this, I fear, will create more problems than it will solve. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks a lot, Violeta. And Violeta was our last panelist, and I wish to thank warmly all of the panelists for their remarks. They have outlined an incredibly insightful picture of the Commission proposal on the much needed changes to which is overall known as a Dublin system, with an emphasis to its implementation in crisis situations. I'm referring here to temporary protection and to SAR operations. I wish now to open the debate, and I do hope the debate will give, for example, Marcello the chance to maybe complete his remarks. I saw on the group chat that he highlighted an essay of his, and I thank him for this. And the floor is open to comments and questions for our panelists. I also wish to thank our panelists for keeping in their time. We have almost 50 minutes for debate. So please feel free to raise your hands via the chat. Luisa Marin has a question for Lilian Surdi. Please, Luisa, take the floor.
Yes, hi, hello. Thanks everybody for your interesting presentation. I have a question for Lilian Surdi on one point that you mentioned at the end of your presentation, which I find very interesting and intriguing, which is indeed how to create a system of accountability which can work in a context where indeed different administrations share different tasks, or they cooperate together for one Yeah, for the definition of a process, for example, the role of EASO, as you mentioned, in cooperating into the Greek procedure, etc. And so, do you think that the role of the agencies can be seen as a co-decider or a role of supporting national administration in the determining process? Because I think that depending on the way we frame it, we can work on constructing different accountability systems for that. I have a question in that regard, indeed.
Well, if you don't mind, I'd like to take like 4 questions, 5 questions, and then give the floor to the speakers. So next question is Daniela Vitiello. She has a question for Marcello and Lilian again.
Thank you. Thanks a lot to all the speakers. I really enjoyed this very special panel. I don't know if Marcello is still with us because he probably had a problem and had to leave. So I will ask my question directly to Lilian. Very, very insightful thought about the role of agency in joint implementation. I've been following your studies on the subject, as you know, and I totally agree on the fact that this joint implementation is a sort of de facto composite procedure, which is emerging in the area of freedom, security, and justice. I would like to ask you to elaborate a little bit more on the role of the Commission in supervising the functioning, the role of agencies. So how is the Commission working with Frontex and EASO in their new role at the borders, and especially in the hotspot approach, but also in the in the border procedure, which is going to be established? Thank you.
Now there's a question which I would like to read myself. A question asked in writing in the chat by Professor Elspeth Guild. So if she doesn't mind, I would read the question, or maybe she wants to take the floor and ask the question herself. No? So I'm going to read it. So the question for Francesco Maiani is, could you please tell us more about return sponsorship and how it fits with solidarity? So if I may, I'd like to join this question because I'm quite interested too in further elaboration on whether an exchange between relocation and return sponsorship is actually a good idea in terms of solidarity, whether it is convincing for him or whether on the contrary, in principle, there's something against this completely new idea of the Commission, which I'm still wondering about the way it came up with, because it's really something I've never heard before this proposal, at least myself. And also last question before I give the floor to the panelists again, and then we can collect further questions later, perhaps. Mario Savino, he has a question, one question for many. Daniel, Marcello, and Francesco. Please, Mario.
Yes, one question for many. It's more a comment, but I'm really interested in their reactions. My impression is that coerciveness goes hand in hand with administrative complexity. It's not just that migrants are not packages, as it was suggested yesterday in our discussion. It's that those packages move by themselves before and after the eventual relocation. And they move according to a complex set of factors, including economic prospects, living conditions, family networks, etc. Now, if the regulator neglects these factors, the regulation itself is doomed to fail. This is quite clear, I think. And I think the reality we have witnessed during the last years shows it patently, openly. So coerciveness can only be the solution when it affects a rather small and manageable category of addressees. Otherwise, if the rule is too rigid and applies to a majority of people of a certain category, such as the one of migrants or asylum seekers, etc., if the rule is too hard, is too rigid, the practice or its implementation inevitably becomes soft. And this is not just a problem of regulatory failure. It's a problem that projects itself on the distrust between member states, because we would go back again to the issue of countries asking for more solidarity and other countries responding, have you done your homeworks? You have rules that you did not respect. So I think we need a less ambitious EU legislation, more pragmatic one that starts from the awareness that administrative capacities of member states are really unevenly distributed, cannot be easily fixed, not even by empowering EU agencies, which are not a panacea. Perhaps what we need, and this is my main question, why don't we introduce some sharper law and economic approach to legislation on migration, something that helps us to highlight the major divide between costs and inefficiencies on one end and real benefits on one end. And by real benefits, I mean not those including political consensus in the short term. Thanks.
So now I will leave the floor to panelists, and Lilian first. Then I cannot see Marcello any longer, actually, so perhaps he's off, as Daniela mentioned. Marcello, are you here? Perhaps he's not.
No, he had to leave. He had to leave for a personal problem.
I see. Okay. So after Lilian, I would say Daniel and Francesco. And then we have further, I'm collecting further questions, and please go on with the questions for next round. Thank you.
Thank you. And I would like also to thank both Luisa and Daniela for their insightful questions, which also included some comments within them. So starting with Luisa, yes, I completely agree with you that we need different accountability arrangements depending on the level of involvement of the agencies. Specifically in what I was referring to in EASO, what I have developed in my literature is different nuances of joint processing, and then the threshold is whether the agency deployees are actually employing what I call executive discretion. So they are doing such a thing in Greece. So emitting an admissibility, let's say an opinion, even if it is non-binding, is an action that includes executive discretion. And for that, I would say we are beyond just support or practical cooperation, and we do need novel mechanisms. So far, where there has been solutions sought was before the European Ombudsman, who has actually been called in 2 cases to decide on procedural irregularities precisely of the role of EASO in hotspots in Greece. And while in the first case, she really, I think, brushed off a bit the issues. In the second, she went more in depth, and she has created, for example, obligations of notification for the agency of when, because the agency has created some kind of internal audit, but then it was just finding procedural mistakes, and it was not notifying the authorities who were continuing with the examination of the obligation. They were saying, oh, we just keep them for internal audit and to, let's say, improve in the future, but that did not help the individuals that were still in the processing. And so the Ombudsman said, no, for example, you have notification obligations to the national authorities once you realize that there has been a mistake in your procedures. So I think that we should move towards Also ombuds type procedures as we have in Frontex, also within EASO, but of course they need to be well resourced. There needs to be independence, there needs to be a strong follow-up. So I'm not just saying it in an unqualified manner or that it is a panacea or that it is working perfectly in Frontex, but that we should work, I believe, towards this type of an extrajudicial, flexible accountability, non-adversarial accountability mechanism for this type of processing. As for the role of the Commission in supervising, it has not been very robust, if you want, in what has been happening in hotspots. In terms of processing, it is clear, for example, that EASO has moved beyond its mandate. The Ombudsman also in her opinions has said as much. So it is a practical, let's say, situation that is being tolerated as a vessel of intra-EU solidarity. Now, as things perhaps morph also into legislation, then perhaps the Commission will also be more robust in supervising the mandate of agencies and how they operationalize it, something that it should be, of course, doing already, but it is not. And there is, among the novelties in the Pact, there is this kind of new monitoring mechanism where the Commission will be much more active, also drawing information from EU agencies, but from the authorities themselves. And it is to be hoped that perhaps in this sense, it will also pass into the nitty-gritty of what is happening in issues such as agency involvement and joint processing. Thank you.
I'm next, if I understand it correctly. No, thanks indeed, Mario, for the question, which I think is a very good question because it forces us to think out of the box and to move somehow beyond the Commission proposals. Because as Francesco and others said, one of the big problems with the Commission proposals is path dependency. And there is, as you say, too much path dependency, not only with solidarity and secondary movements, also with the agencies. I'm very much in favor of stronger agencies, as Lilian said, but that in itself, as you said, Mario, is no panacea, and it might not be enough as long as we have a third element of path dependency, which you mentioned, which is the complexity of the procedures. So only having stronger EU agencies might not help as long as the procedures are as complex as they are. And that might indeed be a problem which the Commission does not really address, and which might be necessary if we want the common European asylum system to function. Because as a political scientist called Natasha Zaun shows in her research, these very complex procedures might work in the center, and that is in capitals or in well-organized regional capitals like Naples, Florence, Milan, I mean, you name them, and the same in other countries, but they do not work at the European periphery, apparently. That is on islands, be it in Italy, be it in Greece, because it seems quite simply impossible to organize such hyper-complex procedures on islands in the periphery where we do not have big cities, where we do not have a well-functioning bureaucracy, generally speaking. So it might really be necessary to address the complexity problem of European asylum law, which the Commission does not address at all. So I would subscribe to your argument. We really have to consider complexity as well. I'm not fully convinced whether there is a necessary correlation between coerciveness and complexity. I mean, take the take-back procedure, which becomes a notification under the proposals and which is very much streamlined. That's an area where coerciveness can go along with streamlined procedures, as these under the Commission proposals. Also, a regular asylum procedure is very complex in the EU context, even if it is not coercive, but just a regular asylum procedure. So I'm not fully convinced that coerciveness and complexity are necessarily correlated, but complexity is definitely a problem. And even if we beef up the agencies And even if we find a political agreement, all that might not work because we have the complexity issue. And as Kees Gronindek rightly stated, I mean, immediate protection is an idea of having less complexity, of having simple recognition, at least for a temporary period. But as Kees stated rightly, probably, that will not probably be implemented on the ground. So we really have, I hadn't considered it, but you're probably right. We have a complexity issue which we should highlight much more, and which we need to address in addition to all the other solutions like stronger agencies and the like.
I think I'm next, if I'm not mistaken. So we'll come back to what Daniel said in a moment, because of course Mario's questions was addressed to me as well. But I'd like to first address Elspeth's question. Could you tell us more about return sponsorship and solidarity? Of course, not a lot more, in the sense that I still sense that I got to keep it short because we need to have a second round of questions. But you all know, or if you don't, you will shortly, that return sponsorship is basically the idea that instead of offering a relocation place, a member state says, well, I will support you to remove somebody who is subject to return. And if the return procedure fails in 8 months' time, that person can be transferred to me, and I will continue the effort of trying to expel that person. Now, there have been idealistic objections in relation to that coming from Amnesty, for instance, saying that the word solidarity is too noble a thing, basically, to be associated with the dirty business of expelling somebody. And undeniably, it's a dirty business in the sense that it's very complicated, or if not complicated, it raises a lot of costs, a lot of difficulties, and a lot of very difficult things in human terms. But I kind of disagree with this position. I respect it, of course, but I kind of disagree. I mean, support and solidarity, sharing the costs, can come in many forms and can concern all the aspects of operating a migration system. And as returns are part of the costs and of the operational problems that are met by a state that is managing migration on behalf of all the others on the border, so effective support in that area counts as good support in my book in terms of state-to-state solidarity. What I see as very problematic, but I mean, this is just my opinion, and I'm entirely respectful of more idealistic perceptions of the problem. But in my view, there are two pragmatic problems with the concept. One of those, I think I highlighted already. The first leg of the commitment, which is to say, I help you in doing the return part of the process, is extremely non-committing. I mean, if you look at I really wanted to show you the provision, because a state, the return sponsor can get away with very little and leave essentially all the costs and all the difficulties on the shoulders of the so-called beneficiary states. And in terms of solidarity concept, that alone discredits the whole concept. If we move to the second part, which says, well, okay, but then if the other states, stays put and doesn't do anything for 8 months, and then there is the transfer, well, even glossing over the many difficulties that there are with that, and the fact that there are costs incurred over 8 months by the so-called beneficiary state, I am very doubtful of a solidarity concept that leads us through the process of transferring a person from that is about to be returned to his state of origin or to a state of transit. Well, you got a person that has to be expelled, and what you do is to expel her to another member state that will then try to do the same thing. And no matter, I mean, whatever the solidarity gains in terms of, effective migration management, it's just plain absurd. sorry to use a strong word, but the persons who came up with the concept clearly have no idea of the complexity, the costs, the human costs of transferring somebody coercively, as it would undoubtedly be from a state to another. So, and I have very strong reservation with the idea, but this reservation really deal with the two aspects that I mentioned. And this leads me to Mario's point, because of course you're shoehorning another coercive procedure in something that is already complicated enough, which is, you know, expelling somebody to another state. And here I would like to make a gloss on what Daniel said. Does coerciveness go hand in hand with complexity? Yes and no. Legally speaking, yes, there are hidden complexities that are not reflected on the surface of the procedure. As soon as you bring coerciveness in the process, you bring in the need for, you know, the right to be heard, you bring in the need for an effective remedy, etc. All things that you don't need in a consensual procedure of transfer. Okay, so even if you make a very quick and easy notification procedure on paper, it still carries with it a lot of procedural complexity, even though you're not writing it down. And the fact that the Commission is trying to find shortcuts, like cutting down on the right to appeal against transfer, is no good news, because that makes the whole construct legally very vulnerable and very fragile. But the other point is that certainly coercion comes, if not with complexity, certainly with costs, and certainly with inefficiency. And here, Mario, you really are preaching to the choir, because I'm paying credit where it's due. Elspeth and Violetta and Catherine Costello and Marlene Garlick all worked on a wonderful couple of studies for the European Parliament. I myself really drummed on the concept since 2010 with the collective work that we did at Odysseus with Lilian. And I think that I really came back on this in the report for the EP in 2016, and an article that I wrote for Daniel and Lilian for the Maastricht Journal in 2017. I mean, I could not agree more. The real problem here is that if we want to have a system that works, we cannot expect it to work by moving people in mass around, because the complexity and the costs and the slowness and you know, the incentives you give to persons to evade the procedure are simply too big to work on a statistically relevant number of persons. That's why there was all this emphasis on the idea that we need to make a system that, first of all, is attractive for the persons who are going to be relocated. So they need to be recognized as actors, which is something that the Commission proposal doesn't do. They must be given, to the extent that it is politically acceptable, some choice. And the Wikström report, with all its flaws, tried to do at least part of this. And then there are untapped possibilities of financial and operational solidarity. I mean, if we talk about financial, I speak under the authority of Iris, who is here in the virtual audience. But the European solidarity schemes are still very small scale if you relate them to state expenditure in the field. And money travels a lot more easily than persons. I realize that it's not a perfect kind of solidarity. It leaves a lot of problems on the ground, etc. But it certainly could be boosted by a lot and make solidarity a lot more predictable without entering into all this administrative mess. Sorry if I took a little longer than I wanted to.
Thank you, Francisco. And I will now move to the next set and perhaps last set of questions. I have a question asked in writing by Jean-Pierre Casarino to Violeta Moreno-Lax. He asked me to read the question because it doesn't have a good connection. So the question is as follows. You mentioned the rule according to which Sargos vessels have to be, quote, well equipped in order to ensure safety of navigation on board. You also added that this rule does not apply to Libyan Coast and Guards vessels. So here is the question. Do you think that the reason for this is because Libyan Coast Guards vessels are not European and not subject to this rule? And if so, can we potentially consider that SAR and GAUS vessels may or could circumvent this rule by flying an unknown EU flag? Violeta?
Yep.
So yes, I would go on with, I will move on to further.
All right, okay.
I just wanted to be sure that you could hear me. Okay. And so next is Iris Goldner Lang. She also asked the question in writing, so I would like to ask her whether she wants me to read it or whether she can answer the question. She can ask the question herself. She has a general question to any of the panelists who would like to respond. So I understand that I should be reading it, and this is the question. Do you think that it is likely that the Pact actually gets adopted or fails like the previous attempt of reform? And if so, do you expect many changes to the Commission's proposal and that this will happen or within the next year? So that's the question. So we have other questions. Let me, yes. Okay, so no, here we are. So there are those two questions asked in writing. So I wonder whether there are other questions. Well, if not, I have a question myself, if I may. Yeah, there's another question though, probably. Mario, is this a question? Problems that have been completed? No, it was a comment.
Oh, no, it's just a comment. It
was a comment, sorry. So I would like to ask actually a question to Daniel. I think I've always been thinking actually that concerning secondary movement, there is a solution, which is actually an egg of Columbus. The solution is actually to allow asylum seekers to pick up the country they would like to live in. And of course, it's but it's not practical. I'm sure it's not viable, but still it is an egg of Columbus, and even we're all aware of the fact that in the Geneva Convention there's no right for asylum seekers to pick up the country they would like to seek asylum from, and this is the main point, I think. So the question is, do you think it's really compatible with modern human rights law that we fight against asylum seekers, against the will to choose the country they would like to live in? So that's the question. So, Violeta, if there are no other questions, I would give the floor to Violeta Moreno-Lax once again.
Thank you. It's a complex issue, and I'm apparently, wasn't very clear, but in the time allocated, I couldn't manage really a fulsome explanation. So safety and equipment criteria apply to all parties that have ratified the Search and Rescue Convention and the SOLAS, or Safety of Life at Sea Convention. That is to state-run search and rescue services fleets rather than private vessels. So why is this? The assumption is that search and rescue duties are going to be fulfilled on a routine basis by official search and rescue services of the parties that have ratified the Search and Rescue Convention and the SOLAS Convention, right? And the idea is that private vessels are only going to be called upon to intervene in rescue operations on a sporadic basis. That is the assumption when the Search and Rescue Conventions were put in place. The reality, however, in the Mediterranean since the 2010s has reversed, so that now it is no longer true that you should be expecting search and rescue to be performed by state fleets, that being Italy, Malta, Greek, or Spanish search and rescue services, but in a very big proportion of cases that have been estimated to up to 2/3 of the total rescues in the Mediterranean, that has happened through private vessels, the majority of which are search and rescue NGO run vessels, right? And so what the European Commission is now proposing, rather than augmenting the official search and rescue capacity as it is due under international law, what they are saying is, let's leave things as they are. And what we're going to be doing is to police search and rescue organization vessels to make sure that they comply with the same standards. But what I think is a bit perverse is that that seal of compliance with the standards that are designed to translate obligations on the official search and rescue services of the state parties to the relevant instruments are not going to be enforceable on Libya or any other third party, because they are not, I mean, there simply is no jurisdiction to do that. But there is not even a mention that for cooperation with third parties, including Libya or say Turkey or Tunisia or any other Mediterranean neighbor, there is no check for human rights, for example, which should have been introduced. I mean, that is not because you could enforce those obligations on third countries, but because of the extraterritorial obligations of the EU member states themselves. They should make sure that in engaging with third parties, including third countries, they are going to be able to comply with their own obligations. So that is the paradox that I'm saying is at the heart of the SAR recommendation by the Commission, that they are imposing, so they are sort of transposing obligations which are officially on the search and rescue services fleets of the member states. They are transposing that to the search and rescue NGOs vessels. And I think that is disingenuous, and it's on top of everything, a manner through which they can control the actions of these organizations, because obviously nowhere has it been defined what amounts to appropriate equipment or safety or any of those terms. It has not been defined anywhere, and we don't know exactly what would be an overwhelming number of rescuees that would make navigation unsafe, for example. What has been making rescue incidents and operations unsafe, or at least part of what has rendered these incidents unsafe, is the lack of disembarkation that has been negated through the closed ports policy of Salvini. So that is an unsafety that has been engineered from within the system, not due to a situation that is naturally occurring in the maritime framework, right? The other thing that I wanted to mention, if I may, in terms of what Mario Sabino asked in the beginning, like why don't we pursue a more economic approach and take better account of costs and benefits when designing policy responses and law and so on? And I mean, I'm going to make a controversial comment maybe, but maybe representing the more liberal voice amongst us, I like to take the heat on this one. What I think is, why would you be pragmatic in regulation, and why would you make an appropriate cost and benefits analysis if you wanted to introduce new rules or new policies? One motivation would be to ensure compliance by the addressees. But I do not think that that is the ultimate purpose of the regulations that we see emerging in the area of immigration and border control. The ultimate purpose is deterrence. The ultimate purpose is the disappearance of the addressee. We do not want refugees. We don't want them to come. And in this pact, in this new pact, I think the line between irregular migrants and asylum seekers is forever eliminated. They're both the same. I mean, they're both going to be subjected to the same procedures, the same pre-screening process. There is no account of Article 31 of the Geneva Convention. The categories have been blurred. And in that blurring, it means that action that you would typically adopt against irregular migrants appears to be legitimized vis-a-vis asylum seekers too. Obviously that it's not stated with all the letters, and I don't think we're ever going to be seeing this black and white, but the links are there, and I think it's our role to make them visible. The foremost purpose is containment, not fostering compliance. So the foremost objective of these new regulations and so on is not to channel applicants in the adequate procedure, but at foremost containment in countries of origin and transit so that they do not come and we don't have to deal with them. And that's why there is this call for coherence between the internal and external approach, and this doubling down on cooperation with third countries, particularly through the partnerships against smuggling. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Violetta, for your remarks. And the organizers asked me to close the panel by 20 past 4, 22, 23 past 4. And I think that the audience definitely needs a break before next panel. So what I would do is to give the floor to Daniel, if he would like to answer very quickly to my questions. So I would say to make a very quick remark to my question, maybe there's no answer. And then I would give the floor once again to all panelists. And I will start by Daniel. So if you can merge the two parts and in the same order as they followed in the panel, with the exception of Marcello, unfortunately, in order to answer the last question on the future. And I think this is a very good connection to the next panel, which is very much about perspective for this reform. Thank you. And,
yes.
and sorry to, I need to highlight that please try to keep your intervention in like 3 minutes, if you may. Thank you.
I hope I can repeat my track record in being quick. I will actually start with the question on the future and Iris' question whether it will be adopted. I think it's easier to predict who wins a US presidential election when to say whether the Pact will be adopted or not. But I think there is a window of opportunity for the simple reason that there are too many actors who have said for too many years that the system we have is dysfunctional and that Dublin is dead and that we need something new. That pressure has been built up politically to do something about it, and if it is only for the sole reason of showing that something is done. So I think there is an opportunity, and politically I agree with the analysis of Violetta that the narrative of fighting illegal migration and detracting people from arriving in Europe might help that agreement, whether we like it or not, because there doesn't seem to be much appetite among member states at the moment for a more welcoming refugee regime. So I see a window of opportunity. A completely different matter is, of course, whether these rules will work in practice, and we all have doubts, but that might not prevent the legislature from agreeing on them. The question by Emanuela, I mean, as a matter of positive human rights law, the answer is most probably no. There is no question of asylum seekers' choice. As a matter of, as a more broader analysis, also taking into account more normative considerations, I mean, the bottom line would be to what extent we would allow for free movement, both for asylum seekers, which let us remember include both refugees and people who will not qualify for protection, because if you allow choice of the asylum countries, you at the same time allow free movement for those who will not qualify for protection. And we all know that returns are terribly difficult. I think as a matter also from a normative perspective for refugees, the argument is stronger. Though not as a matter of positive law, but for asylum seekers who will not qualify, I think the argument is very difficult to make that they should be able to go to a country of their choice. Thirdly, and very briefly, going back to what Francesco said, I would actually disagree on one point. I think the Commission takes asylum seekers as an actor seriously, but it does so very indirectly for the simple reason that doing so increases the political likelihood that the legislature agrees on the proposals. I mean, the extended family definition is probably also from a normative perspective, going back to Emanuela's question, the one scenario where most people would argue it's somehow legitimate to let asylum seekers choose. So a broader definition of family life takes them seriously as actors. The same applies to studies and work, even though very few people would be covered by these rules. And then the meaningful links, it's of course a great idea, as we all agree, for the reasons which Mario politely copy-pasted into the comment section from the blog post I have written. And let's hope that if the meaningful links stay in the proposal, that then the legislature specifies more precisely during the process what it means in praxis. And lastly, there was also a question by Tom Martel on why the Commission maintains the transfer of jurisdiction. I think it did so because it understood or understands quite well that both from an administrative perspective and from a policy perspective, the status quo cannot really be changed decisively, for the simple reason that big relocation schemes are both politically and administratively not feasible. So it understands there will be less solidarity than some had hoped for. And so as at the other side of the coin, it accepts that irregular secondary movements will in many cases still result in a transfer of jurisdiction. So indirectly through the back door, it reintroduces free choice, but only for those who officially disregard the rules.
Thank you. Lilian?
Yes, thank you. There was actually no question directly addressed to me, but I will very, very briefly pick up on the one of Iris, turning it into whether it will be adopted or not. It's that I think that even if it is adopted, I do not believe that it is going to effectively, if you want, and in a long-term manner, address the basic deficiencies and problematic premises, let's say, that exist. If anything else, it might create new additional ones. So I do think that this pact is again another step in the road towards more radical redesign, one of which could be also the financial actually aspects that I'm also, that Iris, you are working on, that I'm also interested in. So, but it didn't seem that the member states and the EU were ready for such a step for now. So maybe we do need another, if you want, round of proposals that will be less effective, that we experience that, and that perhaps we will then be collectively ready to move to more radical solutions, which may though have more, let's say, potential to actually be effective. So I leave it at that.
And Francesco, a quick prediction on possible approval of the pact?
Well, there are at least 2 points I wanted to address. One is that, and the other one is the one you raised about free choice, because I completely take on board the point that Daniel made. I mean, it's true, the Commission has taken applicants into account as actors, but still in a sense of, you know, trying to steer them around, but not as actors who have a voice in the whole thing. That's what I meant. And in doing this, there are actually many possibilities. And if we go back to I had been thinking a lot about this when I wrote the article, because it was really an article about whether sharing people against their will is a sustainable mechanism. And secondary movements are very much a part of that. So I had agreed with ECRE that came out with the idea, with the policy proposal of going to free choice. And I think that free choice has got many virtues. It's completely politically unfeasible. If you shout free choice in a room in the Justus Lipsius building, you will be brought immediately to a security room and locked in for some time. If you do that at the commission, you do at your own peril. You probably will be lynched on the spot. So it's not something you can really float politically. But between that and the dogma of no choice that we have now, there are a lot of things that go in between. And the one that I had suggested was actually to make Dublin avoid the coercive take charge transfer and to have a strengthened basic rule that applications are examined where they are made, and then you try with voluntary incentive to improve the situation from distributive point of view and correct the imbalances that would certainly come via other forms of solidarity. I mean, if anybody's interested, that's fully in my latest publications on that. There was the Tampere 2 where I had come back on this point, etc. So, but what I wanted to say was not to push my own publication. That was not the purpose, even though it seems like that. What I wanted to say is that between pure free choice and what we are seeing now, there is a spectrum of possibilities to try to achieve a system that is less heavy and bureaucratic. And of course, taking into account meaningful links, as Daniel said, is one of the parts of that recipe and a very important one. As to predictions, I'm not good at gauging this kind of things. I will confess that I really have no idea whether this will fly or it won't fly. If people go reading through the document, really, if people at the EP will really go to the bottom of things, they will realize that a lot of things that are in the proposal are those that they rejected and refused with the Wikström report. And one may ask, why then would you take them on board now? But I will not go into political feasibility. To me, the important comment was the one that Lilian just made. Even if we adopt this package, it will not solve our woes, basically. That's my key impression. And in this perspective, I think that whatever leads us to focusing on the real urgencies and emergencies, which are the dwindling respect for EU law on the ground, the fact that a lot more could be done within the existing legal framework to address those imbalances, including boosting forms of solidarity that are not linked to distributing people, then if we realize this, we probably will be one step closer to having a more functioning common European and asylum system. I see this proposal as kind of a weapon of mass distraction from what the real points are to be solved in order to get to a better functioning common European asylum system.
Thank you, Francesco. Now, if I may, I'd like to abuse of my powers as chair to leave little more room to Kes, who didn't have the chance to react. We didn't hear his voice anymore after his speech. And I would leave Violetta the last word with predictions, but if he likes, I would like to leave Kes a little more time.
It's very kind of you, but I think I basically want to make 2 points. The shortest one is on Iris' question. My bet would be that about the same will happen as with the 2016 proposals. Some will be accepted by the member states and others will not. Although the whole thing has been presented as one package, my bet would be that for instance, the proposal on Eurodac, maybe the changes in the competences of EASO and a modified crisis and force majeure directive will be adopted, and some of the others won't. So not the whole package or not all or nothing, but a choice, things that give member states more competences, basically. My second point is about the return sponsorship, and I fully agree with almost everything that Francesco said on that point. I mean, about the administrative problems and human misery moving large numbers of people forcibly around in Europe and outside Europe. But I was a bit surprised that it is almost presented as if this is a problem between member states only. But if I imagine from the perspective of an asylum seeker, now not only being confronted with one member state, but during 8 months, there are 2 member states who are responsible and can point to each other. And then there's, of course, Frontex. So all the problems that Lilian talked about will be increased, because an individual will be confronted with 2 states and an EU agency that all have their responsibilities and all say that they don't take the decisions, but others take the decisions. So this is a nightmare from their perspective. And my fear is that the asylum seekers are more or less instrumentalized to solve the problems of a lack of solidarity between the member states. That was my point.
Thanks a lot. So last word to Violeta, please.
Thank you. What a responsibility. I'll be short because I took longer before. So on the prospects of the new pact being adopted, I mean, what do I know? I mean, I don't have a foretelling sort of capacities, but I'm not optimistic, and I do not think that the solidarity system as it currently stands is going to be palatable to the Visegrad member states, not least. And I do not think the European Parliament reads carefully the provisions is going to be very satisfied that states of emergency in the form of crisis and force majeure and all of this can be decreed with absolutely no democratic oversight. I mean, there is no input whatsoever for the European Parliament in any of these processes. So I do not think that it's going to be a palatable approach by the European Parliament. On the other hand, I'd like to agree with Lilian that even if the Pact proposals were adopted, ultimately what this means, I think, I mean, obviously simplifying a little bit, is a rulification as in the embedment into EU rules of the current situation, opening up for the possibility of 1,000 little new Morias emerging in the European Union territory as well as abroad. So I do not think that this is going to be the medicine that we need. If the motive for the entire reform was to avoid situations of misery and catastrophe as witnessed in Moria and with the hotspots scheme in other parts of the European Union. What this package does is to entrench and constitutionalize and therefore legitimize the hotspot approach, and to make its emergence and export outside of the European Union a real possibility. And I think there's reason for concern, if not just because we're going to be creating misery within our own borders, also because there will be no power, no jurisdiction to control what happens externally. And therefore, we're going to be creating a situation beyond our control, but within our responsibility, which is going to be hard to shake and will entrench and deepen the misery that we've been living through the Moria experience. Sorry for being a pessimistic.
So once again, thanks a lot to everyone. And now I would also like to add my thanks to the audience. See you very soon, like in 5 minutes, I think, less than 5 minutes perhaps, for next round.